A crossbow is a type of ranged weapon based on the bow and consisting of a horizontal bow-like assembly mounted on a frame which is handheld in a similar fashion to the stock of a gun. It shoots arrow-like projectiles called bolts or quarrels. The medieval crossbow was called by many names, most of which were derived from the word ballista, a torsion siege engine resembling a crossbow. Historically, crossbows played a significant role in the warfare of East Asia and medieval Europe. The earliest crossbows in the world were invented in ancient China and caused a major shift in the role of projectile weaponry. The traditional bow and arrow had long been a specialized weapon that required a considerable user training, physical strength, and expertise to operate with any degree of practical efficiency. In many cultures, bowmen were considered a separate and superior caste, despite usually being drawn from the common class, as their archery skill set was essentially developed from birth, similar to many horseman cultures, and was impossible to reproduce outside a pre-established cultural tradition, which many nations lacked. In contrast, the crossbow was the first projectile weapon to be simple, cheap, and physically undemanding enough to be operated by large numbers of conscript soldiers, thus enabling virtually any nation to field a potent force of ranged crossbowmen with little expense beyond the cost of the weapons themselves. In modern times, crossbows have been largely supplanted by firearms in most roles, but are still widely used for shooting sports, hunting, and when shooting with relative silence is important. Construction. A crossbow is essentially a bow mounted on an elongated frame, called a tiller or stock, with a built-in mechanism that holds the drawn bow string, as well as a trigger mechanism that allows the string to be released. The earliest designs featured a transverse slot in the top surface of the frame, down into which the string was placed. To shoot this design, a vertical rod is thrust up through a hole in the bottom of the notch, forcing the string out. This rod is usually attached perpendicular to a rear-facing lever called a tickler. A later design implemented a rolling cylindrical pawl called a nut to retain the string. This nut has a perpendicular center slot for the bolt, and an intersecting axial slot for the string, along with a lower face or slot against which the internal trigger sits. They often also have some form of strengthening internal sear or trigger face, usually of metal. These roller nuts were either free-floating in their close-fitting hole across the stock, tied in with a binding of sinew or other strong cording, or mounted on a metal axle or pins. Removable or integral plates of wood, ivory, or metal on the sides of the stock kept the nut in place laterally. Nuts were made of antler, bone, or metal. Bows could be kept taut and ready to shoot for some time with little physical straining, allowing crossbowmen to aim better without fatiguing. The bow, called the prod or lath on a crossbow, of early crossbows was made of a single piece of wood, usually ash or yew. Composite bows are made from layers of different material, often wood, horn, and sinew glued together and bound with animal tendon. These composite bows made of several layers are much stronger and more efficient in releasing energy than simple wooden bows. As steel became more widely available in Europe around the 14th century, steel prods came into use. The crossbow prod is very short compared to ordinary bows, resulting in a short draw length. This leads to a higher draw weight in order to store the same amount of energy. Furthermore, the thick prods are a bit less efficient at releasing energy, but more energy can be stored by a crossbow. Traditionally, the prod was often lashed to the stock with rope, whipcord, or other strong cording. This cording is called the bridle. The strings for a crossbow are typically made of strong fibers that would not tend to fray. Whipcord was very common, however linen, hemp, and sinew were used as well. In wet conditions, twisted mulberry root was occasionally used. Very light crossbows can be drawn by hand, but heavier types need the help of mechanical devices. The simplest version of mechanical cocking device is a hook attached to a belt, drawing the bow by straightening the legs. Other devices are hinged levers, which either pulled or pushed the string into place, cranked rack and pinion devices called cranequins, and multiple cord and pulley cranked devices called windlasses. Variants. Crossbows exist in different variants. One way to classify them is the acceleration system, while another is the size and energy, degree of automation or projectiles. A recurve crossbow is a bow that has tips curving away from the archer. The recurve bow's bent limbs have a longer draw length than an equivalent straight-limbed bow, giving more acceleration to the projectile and less hand shock. Recurved limbs also put greater strain on the materials used to make the bow, and they may make more noise with the shot. Multiple bow systems have a special system of pulling the sinew via several bows, which can be recurve bows. The workings can be compared to a modern compound bow system. The weapon uses several different bows instead of one bow with a tackle system to achieve a higher acceleration of the sinew via the multiplication with each bow's pulling effect. A compound crossbow is a modern crossbow and is similar to a compound bow. The limbs are usually much stiffer than those of a recurve crossbow. This limb stiffness makes the compound bow more energy efficient than other bows, but the limbs are too stiff to be drawn comfortably with a string attached directly to them. The compound bow has the string attached to the pulleys, one or both of which has one or more cables attached to the opposite limb. When the string is drawn back, the string causes the pulleys to turn. This causes the pulleys to pull the cables, which in turn causes the limbs to bend and thus store energy. Other types of compound bows use either, one or both, chem-shaped or eccentrically mounted pulleys in order to provide a let-off, such that the archer is not holding against the maximum draw weight of the bow while trying to aim. But, in a crossbow, the string is held back mechanically, so there is no advantage in providing a let-off. Therefore, compound crossbows generally only use pulleys that are both round and concentrically mounted, in order to capture the maximum available energy from the relatively short draw length. The smallest crossbows are pistol crossbows. Others are simple long stocks with the crossbow mounted on them. These could be shot from under the arm. The next step in development was stocks of the shape that would later be used for firearms, which allowed better aiming. The arbalest was a heavy crossbow that required special systems for pulling the sinew via windlasses. For siege warfare, the size of crossbows was further increased to hurl large projectiles, such as rocks, at fortifications. The required crossbows needed a massive base frame and powerful windlass devices. Such devices include the oxy-bells. The ballista has torsion springs replacing the elastic prod of the oxy-bells, but later also developed into smaller versions. Ballista is still the root word for crossbow in Romance languages such as Italian, balestra, and Spanish, ballesta. The repeating crossbow automated the separate actions of stringing the bow, placing the projectile and shooting. This way the task can be accomplished with a simple one-handed movement, while keeping the weapon stationary. As a result, it is possible to shoot at a faster rate compared to an unmodified version. The Greek polybolos was an ancient repeating ballista reputedly invented by Dionysius of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. The Chinese repeating crossbow, Chu Ko Nu, is a handheld crossbow that accomplishes the task with a magazine containing a number of bolts on top. The mechanism is worked by moving a rectangular lever forward and backward. The weapon was mainly used as a weapon against lightly armored soldiers, since it shot small bolts that were often dipped in poison. A bullet crossbow is a type of handheld crossbow that, instead of arrows or bolts, shoots spherical projectiles made of stone, clay, or lead. There are two variants, one has a double string with a pocket for the projectile, and the other has a barrel with a slot for the string. A slurbow is a type of crossbow with a wood or metal barrel over the top of the stock that is arguably influenced by the emergence of the pistol. Projectiles. The arrow-like projectiles of a crossbow are called bolts. These are much shorter than arrows, but can be several times heavier. There is an optimum weight for bolts to achieve maximum kinetic energy, which varies depending on the strength and characteristics of the crossbow, but most could pass through common mail. In ancient times, the bolts of a strong crossbow were usually several times heavier than arrows. Modern bolts are stamped with a proof mark to ensure their consistent weight. Bolts do not have fletching, i.e. feathered ends like those commonly seen on arrows. Crossbow bolts can be fitted with a variety of heads, some with sickle-shaped heads to cut rope or rigging, but the most common today is a four-sided point called a quarrel. A highly specialized type of bolt is employed to collect blubber biopsy samples used in biology research. Most modern crossbow hunters incorrectly refer to the bolts as arrows, due to the similar appearance, but the physics of how a bolt finds its target are different than that of an arrow used in a vertical bow. Crossbows can also be adapted to shoot lead bullets or rocks, in which case they are called stone bows. Primarily used for hunting wildfowl, these usually have a double string with a pouch between the strings to hold the projectile. Even relatively small differences in arrow weight can have a considerable impact on its drop and, conversely, its flight trajectory. Accessories. The ancient Chinese crossbow often included a metal, i.e. bronze or steel, grid serving as iron sights. Modern crossbow sights often use similar technology to modern firearm sights, such as red dot sights and telescopic sights. Many crossbow scopes feature multiple crosshairs to compensate for the significant effects of gravity over different ranges. In most cases, a newly bought crossbow will need to be sighted for accurate shooting. Quivers can be mounted to hold ammunition. These are often made from plastic and usually hold the bolts in fixed positions along the structure. A popular detachable design consists of a main arm that is attached to the weapon, a plate on one end that secures 4 or more individual bolts at a point on their shafts, and at the other end a cover that secures their heads. This kind of quiver is attached under the front of the crossbow, parallel to the string, and is designed to be quickly detached and reattached. Other designs hold bolts underneath the crossbow parallel to the stock, sometimes on either side of the crossbow. A major cause of the sound of shooting a crossbow is vibration of various components. Crossbow silencers are multiple components placed on high vibration parts, such as the string and limbs, to dampen vibration and suppress the sound of loosing the bolt. History. East Asia. The earliest evidence of crossbows comes from ancient China in the form of crossbow triggers dating back to the 6th century BC. According to Sir Joseph Needham in his Science and Civilization in China, it is not possible to pinpoint exactly which of the East Asian peoples invented the crossbow. However, there is unquestionable evidence that the crossbow was used for military purposes at least as far back as the Warring States period, from the second half of the 4th century BC onwards. In terms of archaeological evidence, bronze crossbow bolts dating from as early as the mid-5th century BC have been found at a Chu burial site in Udaishan, Hebei. The earliest handheld crossbow stocks with bronze trigger, dating from the 6th century BC, were found in Tomb 3 and 12 at Khufu, Shandong, previously the capital of Lu, ancient China. Other early finds of crossbows were discovered in Tomb 138 at Xiaobeitang, Hunan, dating to the mid-4th century BC. Ammunition for crossbows could have also been spherical. In discussing the astronomical topics such as solar and lunar eclipses, the Western Han-era mathematician and music theorist Jing Fang, 78–37 BC, wrote that the moon, shaped like a ball, produced no light and was illuminated only by the sun, which he compared to the shape of a round crossbow bullet. Repeating crossbows, first mentioned in the records of the Three Kingdoms, were discovered in 1986 in Tomb 47 at Qinjiazhuai, Hebei, and were dated to around the 4th century BC. The earliest Chinese document mentioning a crossbow were texts from the 4th to 3rd centuries BC attributed to the followers of Mozi. Sun Tzu's influential treatise on war, The Art of War, first appearance dated to sometime between 500 BC to 300 BC, refers in Chapter 5 to the traits of crossbows and in Chapter 12, to the usage of crossbows. One of the earliest reliable descriptions of this weapon in warfare is of an ambush in 341 BC, the Battle of Maling. In the opinion of one authority, the crossbow, Chinese, pinyin, n, had become nothing less than the standard weapon of the Han armies by the 2nd century BC. The earliest textual evidence of the handheld crossbow used in battle dates to the 4th century BC. Handheld crossbows with complex bronze trigger mechanisms have also been found with the Terracotta Army in the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, r. 221–210 BC, that are similar to specimens from the subsequent Han Dynasty, 202 BC 220 AD, while crossbowmen described in the Qin and Han Dynasty learned drill formations. Some were even mounted as cavalry units, and Han Dynasty writers attributed the success of numerous battles against the Xiongnu to massed crossbow volleys. The bronze triggers were designed in such a way that they were able to store a large amount of energy within the bow when drawn, but was easily shot with little recoil when the trigger were pulled. This allowed it for precision shooting. The metal portions of the crossbow were also mass-produced with precision, with the bronze mechanisms being interchangeable. Finally, the Qin and Han dynasties also developed crossbow shooting lines, with alternating rows of crossbowmen shooting and reloading in a manner similar to a musket firing line. Different varieties of crossbows were also developed, such as the repeating crossbow, multi-shot crossbow, larger field artillery crossbows, and repeating multi-shot crossbow. According to the Six Secrets teachings by Tai Kong from the Warring States era, an ideal army proportion was 30% crossbowmen, armored soldiers, 10,000. Strong crossbowmen, 6,000. Halberdiers with shields, 2,000. Spearmen with shields, 2,000. Skilled men to repair offensive weapons and sharpen them, 300. During the time of the Tang dynasty, the use of crossbows fell out of favor and traditional recurve bows were more prioritized. Crossbows eventually made a resurgence during the Song dynasty that succeeded the Tang dynasty. An 11th century writer remarks that the Tang had so little confidence in the crossbow that they equipped its users with halberds for self-defense. They then tended to succumb to the temptation to throw down their crossbows and charge, so that other men had to be sent to follow them and pick up the discarded weapons. One source gives the ratio of bows to crossbows in the ideal army as 5:1. The people of the Korean peninsula have also used crossbows. Many archaeological specimens of the crossbow, ranging from 2-1 BC, were excavated near Pyongyang. The books of Samguk-sajai, Jikwanji, Mugwahunjo, and Goraiyajan, of the Book of Jo, records detailed descriptions of the usage of crossbows of Goguryeo and Silla. Goguryeo used greatly large versions of the crossbow, called Pono, stationary, and Jiaono. Southeast Asia. In Vietnamese historical legend, General Thc Phan, who ruled over the ancient kingdom of Olc from 257 to 207 BC, is said to have owed his power to a magic crossbow, capable of shooting thousands of bolts at once. Crossbow technology for multi-prodded crossbows was transferred from the Chinese to Kampa, which Kampa used in its invasion of the Khmer Empire's Angkor in 1177. China transferred crossbow technology to Kampa. When the Khams sacked Angkor, they used the Chinese siege crossbow. Crossbows were given to the Khams by China. Crossbows and archery while mounted were instructed to the Cham by a Chinese in 1171. Ancient Greece. The earliest reasonably reliable date for the use of crossbows in Europe is in ancient Greece from the 5th century BC. The historian Diodorus Siculus, fluid 1st century BC, described the invention of a mechanical arrow-shooting catapult, katapultikon, by a Greek task force in 399 BC. According to the inventor Hero of Alexandria, fluid 1st century AD, who referred to the now lost works of the 3rd century BC engineer Tisabius, this weapon was inspired by an earlier hand crossbow, called the gastrap heats, belly shooter, which could store more energy than the Greek bows. A detailed description of the gastrap heats, along with a drawing, is found in Heron's technical treatise Bella Pioca. The gastrap heats was powered by a composite bow. It was cocked by resting the stomach in a concavity at the rear of the stock and pressing down with all strength. In this way, considerably more energy can be summoned up than by using only one arm of the archer as in the hand bow. The heavy weight and bulk of the gastrap heats may have necessitated a prop to keep it standing, i.e. by mounting it on a defensive wall or using a portable prop. Described two advanced forms of the gastrap heats, which he credits to Zopyrus, an engineer from southern Italy. Zopyrus has been plausibly equated with a Pythagorean of that name who seems to have flourished in the late 5th century BC. He probably designed his bow machines on the occasion of the sieges of Cumae and Milet between 421 BC and 401 BC. The bows of these machines already featured a winched pull-back system and could apparently throw 2 missiles at once. From the mid-4th century BC onwards, evidence of the Greek use of crossbows becomes more dense and varied. Arrow shooting machines, katapultai, are briefly mentioned by Aeneas Tacticus in his treatise on siegecraft written around 350 BC. An Athenian inventory from 330–329 BC includes catapults, bolts with heads and flights. Arrow shooting machines in action are reported from Philip II's siege of Perinthos in Thrace in 340 BC. At the same time, Greek fortifications began to feature high towers with shuttered windows in the top, presumably to house anti-personnel arrow shooters, as in Agosthena. The transition to torsion catapults, which are not considered crossbows and came to dominate Greek and Roman artillery design, is first evident in inventories of the Athenian arsenal from between 338 and 326 BC. Ancient Rome. The ancient world knew a variety of mechanical handheld weapons similar to the later medieval crossbow. The exact terminology is a subject of continuing scholarly debate. Roman authors like Vegetius, fluid 4th century, note repeatedly the use of arrow-shooting weapons such as arqueballista and monoballista respectively chiroballista. While most scholars agree that one or more of these terms refer to handheld mechanical weapons, there is disagreement whether these were flexion bows or torsion-powered like the recent Xanten find. The Roman commander Orion, c. 86 after 146, records in his Tactica Roman cavalry training for shooting some mechanical handheld weapon from horseback. Sculptural reliefs from Roman Gaul depict the use of crossbows in hunting scenes. These are remarkably similar to the later medieval crossbow. Medieval Europe. The crossbow is portrayed as a hunting weapon on 4 Pictish stones from early medieval Scotland, 6th to 9th centuries St. Vigen's No. 1, Glenferness, Shandwick, and Magel. It was introduced to England by the invaders during the Norman conquest. After the steel crossbow likely made the weapon more popular around 1100, the Second Lateran Council of 1139 banned Christians from using the crossbow, except for hunting and against infidels. Pope Innocent III reiterated the ban later that century. While a trained longbowman can fire 10 arrows in the time a crossbowman can fire 3 bolts, an untrained archer can learn to use the latter weapon well after 3 weeks of training but would still be a beginner with the former. The use of crossbows in European warfare is again evident from the Battle of Hastings until about the year 1500. They almost completely superseded handbows in many European armies in the 12th century for a number of reasons. In modern tests, longbows showed a higher rate of shot than crossbows of the same energy, due to the difficulty of the shooter in handling the mechanical parts for loading in the same time as the bow was pulled. With lots of training, a longbowman can achieve a high degree of accuracy that is comparable to the much steeper learning curve in aimed shooting with the crossbow. Despite strength training, there are physical limits to the longbow, unlike the crossbow, which can store several times the energy, but will be less efficient in translating stored into kinetic energy due to the thicker spring material. There is no record from the Middle Ages comparing longbowmen and crossbowmen shooting in one army from a similar position, although such occasions are known with visiting Englishmen in the Baltic and Scots in the French army. In the armies of Europe, mounted and unmounted crossbowmen, often mixed with slingers, javeliners and archers, occupied a central position in battle formations. Usually they engaged the enemy in offensive skirmishes before an assault of mounted knights. Crossbowmen were also valuable in counterattacks to protect their infantry. The rank of commanding officer of the crossbowman corps was one of the highest positions in any army of this time. Along with polearm weapons made from farming equipment, the crossbow was also a weapon of choice for insurgent peasants such as the Taborites. Mounted knights armed with lances proved ineffective against formations of pikemen combined with crossbowmen whose weapons could penetrate most knights' armor. The invention of push lever and ratchet drawing mechanisms enabled the use of crossbows on horseback, leading to the development of new cavalry tactics. Knights and mercenaries deployed in triangular formations, with the most heavily armored knights at the front. Some of these riders would carry small, powerful all-metal crossbows of their own. Crossbows were eventually replaced in warfare by more powerful gunpowder weapons, although early guns had slower rates of fire and much worse accuracy than contemporary crossbows. Later, similar competing tactics would feature harquebusiers or musketeers in formation with pikemen, pike and shot, pitted against cavalry firing pistols or carbines. Elsewhere, the Muslims called the crossbow Qas Firangi, or Frankish bow, as the Crusaders used the crossbow against the Arab and Turkic horsemen with remarkable success. The adapted crossbow was used by the Islamic armies in defense of their castles. Later, foot-strapped versions became very popular among the Muslim armies in Iberia. During the Crusades, Europeans were exposed to Muslim composite bows, made from layers of different material, often wood, horn, and sinew glued together and bound with animal tendon. These composite bows could be much more powerful than wooden bows, and were adopted for crossbow prods across Europe. Crossbow prods could be more easily waterproofed than hand bows, which was essential in the humid European climate. In Western Africa and Central Africa, crossbows served as a scouting weapon and for hunting, with enslaved Africans bringing this technology to natives in America. In the American South, the crossbow was used for hunting and warfare when firearms or gunpowder were unavailable because of economic hardships or isolation. In the north of Northern America, light hunting crossbows were traditionally used by the Inuit. These are technologically similar to the African-derived crossbows, but have a different route of influence. The native montagnards of Vietnam's Central Highlands were also known to have used crossbows, as both a tool for hunting, and later, an effective weapon against the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. Montagnard fighters armed with crossbows proved a highly valuable asset to the U.S. Special Forces operating in Vietnam, and it was not uncommon for the Green Berets to integrate Montagnard crossbowmen into their strike teams. The French, and the British used a sauterelle, French for grasshopper, in World War I. It was lighter and more portable than the Leech trench catapult, but less powerful. It weighed 24 kilograms, 53 pounds, and could throw an F-1 grenade or Mills bomb 110-140 m, 120-150 yd. The sauterelle replaced the Leech catapult in British service and was in turn replaced in 1916 by the 2-inch medium trench mortar and Stokes mortar. Modern use: hunting, leisure, and science. Crossbows are used for shooting sports and bow hunting in modern archery and for blubber biopsy samples in scientific research. In some countries such as Canada or the United Kingdom, they may be less heavily regulated than firearms, and thus more popular for hunting. Some jurisdictions have bow and slash or crossbow only seasons. Modern military and paramilitary use. In modern times, crossbows are no longer used for assassinations, but there are still some applications. For example, in the Americas, the Peruvian Army, Ejército, equips some soldiers with crossbows and rope, to establish a zipline in difficult terrain. In Brazil, the CIGS, Jungle Warfare Training Center, also trains soldiers in the use of crossbows. In the United States, SAA International Ltd manufacture a 150 feet LB crossbow-launched version of the U.S. Army Type Classified Launched Grapnel Hook, LGH, among other mine countermeasure solutions designed for the Middle Eastern theater. It has been successfully evaluated in Cambodia and Bosnia. It is used to probe for and detonate tripwire-initiated mines and booby traps at up to 50 meters. The concept is similar to the LGH device, originally only fired from a rifle, as a plastic retrieval line is attached. Reusable up to 20 times, the line can be reeled back in without exposing oneself. The device is of particular use in tactical situations where noise discipline is important. In Europe, British-based Barnett International supplied crossbows to Serbian forces, which according to The Guardian were later used in ambushes and as a counter-sniper weapon against the Kosovo Liberation Army during the Kosovo War in the areas of Pek and Jakovica, southwest of Kosovo. Whitehall launched an investigation, though the Department of Trade and Industry established that, not being on the military list, crossbows were not covered by such export regulations. Paul Beaver of Jane's Defense Publications commented that, "They are not only a silent killer, they also have a psychological effect." On February 15, 2008, Serbian Minister of Defense Dragan Šutanovac was pictured testing a Barnett crossbow during a public exercise of the Serbian Army's Special Forces in NIS, 200 kilometers south of capital Belgrade. Special forces in both Greece and Turkey also continue to employ the crossbow. Spain's Green Berets still use the crossbow as well. In Asia, some Chinese armed forces use crossbows, including the Special Force Snow Leopard Commando Unit of the People's Armed Police and the People's Liberation Army. One justification for this comes in the crossbow's ability to stop persons carrying explosives without risk of causing detonation. During the Xinjiang riots of July 2009, crossbows were used alongside modern military hardware to quell protests. The Indian Navy's Marine Commando Force were equipped until the late 1980s with crossbows supplied with cyanide-tipped bolts, as an alternative to suppressed handguns. Comparison to conventional bows. With a crossbow, archers could release a draw force far in excess of what they could have handled with a bow. Furthermore, the crossbow could hold the tension for a long time, whereas even the strongest longbowman could only hold a drawn bow for a short period of time. The ease of use of a crossbow allows it to be used effectively with little training, while other types of bows take far more skill to shoot accurately. The disadvantage is the greater weight and clumsiness compared to a bow, as well as the slower rate of shooting and the lower efficiency of the acceleration system, but there would be reduced elastic hysteresis, making the crossbow a more accurate weapon. Crossbows have a much smaller draw length than bows. This means that for the same energy to be imparted to the arrow, or bolt, the crossbow has to have a much higher draw weight. A direct comparison between a fast hand-drawn replica crossbow and a longbow show a 6:10 rate of shooting or a 4:9 rate within 30 seconds and comparable weapons. Legal issues. Kin 29 of the Second Lateran Council under Pope Innocent II in 1139 banned the use of crossbows, as well as slings and bows, against Christians. Today, the Crow.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.